Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping into the quiet corners of the Ottoman Empire, where a humble bean is about to change everything. Imagine the year is 1540. You're standing in a damp, stone kitchen tucked behind the ornate latticework of Topkapı Palace in Istanbul. Coals crackle gently, a copper pot steams over open flame, and the air is thick with the unfamiliar scent of something. Toasty, earthy, slightly sweet. Coffee, new, strange, slightly scandalous. You probably won't survive this. By the way, especially if you serve the Sultan his cove lukewarm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge softly across the tiled floor, your slippers scuffing faintly. It's not long before you find yourself behind a serving screen with a gaggle of kitchen boys, all nervously watching a tall man ladle thick, muddy liquid into tiny porcelain cups. His hands are shaking slightly. This isn't tea, the empire's darling drink. This is coffee, the new kid on the beverage block. It's roasted, ground, and boiled into a tarry syrup, unlike anything the palace has sipped before. And this morning, the Sultan wants it for breakfast. You peek over a copper tray stacked with saucers, and the weight of the moment settles in. 1 cup too bitter, and your job is gone. 1 cup too weak, and your head might be too. It's wild to think this now standard morning ritual began with such tension. But back then, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a disruption. Imported from Yemen, prepared in secrecy, and consumed with cautious enthusiasm, it stirred more than mugs. It stirred anxiety, the kind of anxiety that makes a grand vizier demand a spoon that measures precisely 1 dirham of grounds, and not a grain more. Historians still argue whether the earliest Ottoman coffee tasted more like burnt stew or smoky elixir, but everyone agrees it hit like a brick, especially when consumed on an empty stomach. The cook next to you mumbles a sleepy prayer as he wipes sweat from his brow. Coffee's bitter scent lingers in the air, battling the smell of boiled sheep's milk and cardamom oil. It's said the palace tested dozens of combinations, some with cinnamon bark, others with crushed rose petals or a sprinkle of salt. One assistant tried orange zest once and was never seen again. Tonight, you get to stand in his slightly scorched shoes, but your attention shifts as a gilded steward enters the kitchen, raising a single brow. It's the moment of truth. The cups are arranged, the heat just right, the foam sitting thick and proud atop each brew. You lift the silver tray, and suddenly you understand why some court documents described coffee not as a beverage, but as a performance. You shuffle down the echoing corridor, passing guards in silk sashes and eunuchs whispering gossip. Outside, Istanbul stirs. The call to prayer floats on the breeze. Market stalls creak open, cats knock over baskets of figs. But inside, in the hush of Topkapı's harem wing, time slows as the Sultan lifts the first cup of the day. He sips, and for one excruciating moment, you cannot breathe. Then he smiles, just slightly. His vizier nods. You are not beheaded. Excellent. That cup thick as tar, bitter as death sets in motion the empire's centuries-long love affair with coffee. But back here in the warmth of the kitchen, no one's thinking about history. You're thinking about how the coffee grounds clumped unevenly this morning, and whether you should blame the humidity. Oddly enough, later edicts from the court will list humidity as a recognized obstacle to coffee accuracy, and you will thank every divine being in the Ottoman pantheon that someone, somewhere, cared enough to write that down. But for now, you exhale, legs shaking, as the steward takes the tray away. You won't need to fake your own death after all. Of course, this is just the beginning. You still have no idea that within a few decades, this strange bean from the mountains of Yemen will become so integral to Ottoman society that it must be measured, formally, repeatedly, religiously. You don't yet know that scales will be adjusted, spoons will be forged, merchants will be fined, and guilds will stage sit-ins over who gets to decide what 1 cup really means. All you know is that you want another sip of that smoky stuff before the sun gets too high and your duties resume. But as you creep back toward the hearth, one of the kitchen boys stops you. Careful, he whispers. 2nd cups are for eunuchs and poets. A pause. Then he hands you a fresh mug anyway. Just don't tell the vizier. Outside, the city wakes up slowly, like a blanket being pulled off a sleepy empire. The Bosphorus glimmers as spice merchants argue over saffron, and deep beneath the palace arches, someone finally dares to ask Saul, how much coffee should actually go in a cup? The answer, of course, is complicated, but that's where we're headed next. You blink your way into the soft haze of early morning as Istanbul stretches, groans, and slowly comes to life. You're perched now on the edge of a camel caravan, weaving its way through the dusty switchbacks of the Arabian Peninsula because, before the Ottoman elite could sip their carefully measured brew, someone had to get those beans all the way from Yemen. And let's just say, no one was exactly using overnight shipping. It starts in the highlands of Yemen, where the Coffea arabica shrub grows wild and green on sun-drenched terraces. The locals have already been roasting and brewing these beans for centuries. Though historians still argue whether the earliest drinkers were goat herders, monks, or bored porters with long nights to fill. Either way, by the late 1400s, Yemen had a monopoly on the good stuff, and the Ottomans were thirsty. You ride alongside sacks of freshly dried beans packed tight onto camels, each beast a beginning participant in what will become one of the empire's most prized supply chains. The journey from Yemen to Istanbul isn't just long. It's hot, sticky, packed with swarms of flies. You swat at one now, groaning as the caravan trundles over another pebble-strewn ridge. Still, it's worth it, because this is no ordinary cargo. These beans are dark, oily miracles, prized not just for flavor but for function. They keep sailors alert on the Red Sea. They power scribes through tedious copywork, and they give holy men a bit more stamina for evening prayers. Once the beans reach the port of Mocha, yes, that Mocha they're shipped north via Red Sea dhows, their little triangular sails flapping like gossiping tongues. You board one of these boats now, ducking under crates of sesame, gum, Arabic, and dried rose petals. Somewhere near the rudder, a sailor snores peacefully with a pouch of beans clutched to his chest. The sea breeze is soft, but the politics are not. The Ottomans, you see, have a vested interest in this entire operation. After taking over Egypt and the Hejaz in the early 16th century, they essentially secured the world's caffeine supply, or at least the part of the world that mattered to them. From there, coffee began its slow but steady crawl through every corridor of the empire. Istanbul, naturally, became the central hub, and like all empires, the Ottomans had an uncanny knack for turning a bean into a bureaucracy. When the ships reached Suez, porters unload the cargo onto mule trains bound for Cairo. You ride shotgun again, this time bouncing over uneven roads and muttering at the mule that keeps farting in your direction. At one point, you pass a sleepy checkpoint guard chewing pistachios. He waves you through without even checking the cargo. Classic Cairo's coffee. Markets are already humming by the time you arrive. Faded awnings billow overhead, and every other stall seems to be selling the same dusty pile of beans for just slightly more than the last guy. You lean against a cracked wall and watch a merchant bicker with a spice dealer over whether this batch has been over-roasted. Historians still debate how much roasting actually happened in Yemen versus Cairo. Some argue the beans arrived green and were roasted locally. Others insist that the rich, syrupy flavor we now associate with Turkish coffee only emerged after Ottoman cooks got involved. Either way, it didn't stop every merchant from claiming his beans were straight from the terrace. Eventually, the beans are measured into large burlap sacks, each one roughly a mud, a loosely defined volumetric unit that changes depending on who you ask and how much sleep they've had. You try to lift one, you fail. It smells amazing, though like campfire, stone fruit, and just a whiff of bureaucracy. From Cairo, the cargo follows the Nile northward, then cuts east into the Levant. By caravan again, you lose count of how many donkeys you meet. At least 3 try to eat your satchel. One succeeds. And finally, weeks later, you arrive at Istanbul's harbor, where salty dockworkers trade curses and citrus, and the first official whispers of coffee regulation begin. At this point in the journey, the beans have passed through no fewer than 6 local tax zones, 4 vaguely defined trade guilds, and 1 particularly moody eunuch inspector. Still, they've arrived more or less intact, and now they'll be distributed to palace kitchens, merchant stalls, and humble apothecaries, with scales so precise they can weigh a hummingbird's hiccup. You shuffle off the boat, boots squelching slightly, and you realize something. Getting coffee from Yemen to Istanbul is one thing, making sure everyone uses the same amount per cup. That's an entirely different challenge. You're back in Istanbul now, though your feet still feel like they're trudging across desert sand. Luckily, you've made it just in time for morning service at the Palace, routine that has evolved from chaotic experimentation into a ceremony so intricate it could pass for Lostek's ballet. You slide into a nook near the Kavesi Baka, the chief coffee maker of the imperial household. This is no ordinary barista. This man holds a position so esteemed that he answers directly to the Sultan, bypassing even some of the viziers. One wrong move with the ladle, and he could be reassigned to mop duty in the camel stables. Or worse, banished to the tepid milk kitchen. Historians still argue whether the Kavesi Baka was more ceremonial than functional. Some records show he rarely prepared coffee himself, but rather supervised a fleet of assistants. Others claim he personally brewed the Sultan's cup daily. Either way, you're not arguing with a man whose title literally translates to coffee chief. Today's blend is strong-ridged Yemen beans, roasted over grapevine embers, ground by hand with a marble pestle, and heated in a long-handled seize until the foam bulges like a rising moon. The cup must have a frothy crown, but not spill over. The grounds must settle perfectly at the bottom if they swirl in your mouth. It's considered a minor diplomatic incident. You watch as two attendants polish porcelain fincon cups, carefully, inspecting each for chips. Others slice sweetmeats and stuffed dates with rose-water-soaked walnuts. One assistant lines up measuring spoons, each one a little different: tin, brass, wood. And now, for the first time in your sleepy tenure, you begin to notice something peculiar. No two spoons are quite the same. One holds a heaping mound, another dips concavely, like a tiny canoe. Some are worn down at the edges, others sparkle like they were smuggled out of a jewelry box. And yet, they're all supposedly used to portion out a single serving of coffee. You begin to wonder, how did anyone know what a standard portion was? Well, they didn't. Not really. Not yet. The palace may love ritual, but its kitchens, despite their grandeur, still rely on human memory, inherited technique, and guesswork, masquerading as tradition. The Kavesi baker mutters about dirhem, an old unit of measurement derived from the silver coin of the same name. But whether that means 1 spoonful or 1.5, if the vizier looks tired, is up for interpretation. And interpretation, in a palace full of ambition, is a dangerous game. Still, the performance goes on. A young steward glides into the divan room with a tray of steaming cups. You trail quietly behind and peek through a mashrabia screen. There, lounging against velvet cushions, the Sultan lifts his cup in 2 fingers, pinky out not as a joke, but because centuries of etiquette say that's just what one does. He sips, slowly, eyes half-lidded. You can almost hear the Empire exhale. Court coffee service, by now, has become a kind of liturgy. Some days it includes verses from the Quran, recited softly between sips. Other days, just a bored eunuch reading aloud poetry while someone pretends not to fall asleep. One morning, you even witness a silent tasting session where 5 versions of the same blend are served blind, like a sleepy Ottoman version of MasterChef. Naturally, coffee's role at court isn't just about flavor. It's status, symbolism, a gentle flex. The quality of your grounds, the thickness of your foam, the finesse of your pour-all of it, broadcasts power, taste, and competence. Entire diplomatic meetings hinge on whose coffee arrives first, and whose cup is allowed to cool before a toast is made. One particularly delicate morning, a visiting dignitary's cup is returned untouched. You hear whispers of insult, betrayal, and imminent exile. It turns out the brew was simply too hot, but the damage is done. You start to understand why spoons matter. Too much coffee, the drink is sludge. Too little, it's colored water. The ideal amount must allow the drinker 3 sips before reaching the grounds. That's the rule, supposedly, until someone else insists it's 4 sips, and the guilds get involved. And they will. But today, you keep stirring, because, as the morning draws on, and the palace settles into its post-coffee serenity, you realize that the process, though chaotic, works. Somehow, everyone knows their part. The beans arrive, the cups are filled, and the empire, wired on caffeine and rigid ceremony, rolls into another day of bureaucracy and empire-building. Outside, in the cool shade of a pomegranate tree, a steward stretches and sighs. He pulls out a little folding stool and sips the dregs of a leftover cup, muttering something about a new merchant in the bazaar who claims to have invented a measuring spoon that never lies. You smirk. Oh, buddy, just you wait. You're standing now at the threshold of an unassuming wooden door tucked behind the bustle of the Grand Bazaar. You slip through it into a dim, low-ceilinged room. Smoke coils lazily upward toward soot-stained beams. The scent of singed cardamom, wet wool, and tobacco wraps around you like a thick wool blanket. Welcome to the Ottoman coffee house Kavahin. If you want to impress someone who's pretending to read a scroll, you pick a corner, settle onto a cushion that squeaks ever so slightly beneath you, and take in the scene. This is not your average social stop. No, this is where revolutions almost happen then fizzle out, because everyone gets too relaxed to follow through. Around you, men whisper, mutter, and occasionally snort with laughter. They cradle their finken cups like sacred relics, saucers perched delicately on their knees. One man pours coffee from a brass seziv, held a foot above the cup, as if height adds honor, or foam, or both. Here, in the soft fog of smoke and unfiltered opinion, the empire pulses quietly. A minor poet clears his throat and begins a couplet no one asked for. The man beside him nods as if it were a royal decree. Across the room, two elderly merchants argue about camel taxes while playing a game that vaguely resembles chess, but seems to involve pistachios as currency. You slouch deeper. But what really grabs your attention once the murmured verses and drifting pipe smoke fade is the complete chaos in how coffee is measured back here. The coffee house has its own rhythm, its own spoons, its own beliefs about how much ground coffee constitutes a cup. You spot at least 3 styles of ladles. One looks suspiciously like a serving scoop from a candy stall. Another is bent at the tip, perhaps to create an artful pour. Still another is made of carved bone, worn smooth by 1,000 late-night servings. Historians still debate whether this anarchic diversity in spoons was a sign of artisan pride or a complete lack of standardization. It's hard to say, especially when one coffeehouse claims their half-spoon method produces the ideal melancholic clarity, while another insists on 3 heaps for conversation, 5 for poetry. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone could taste the difference with all the clove smoke. And then there's the politics. Because in the Ottoman world, the coffee house isn't just a sleepy retreat, it's a lightning rod for rumors, satire, and, quietly, mutinous thoughts. It's where grievances are brewed alongside beans, and where the line between gentle gossip and treason gets blurry after your 3rd cup. The government knows this, which is why every so often you'll see an official quietly slide into the back, order a drink, and eavesdrop with the subtlety of a brick. Some rulers banned coffeehouses entirely for short stretches. Others allowed them but required special licenses. One sultan reportedly disguised himself to snoop on conversations. You can imagine him sitting right next to you now, muttering interesting, as he hears someone call him a little stingy with the cavalry budget. One legend and verified but delicious tells of a scholar who smuggled forbidden tracts inside hollowed-out coffee beans. Another tale speaks of a cafe that served revolution with a splash of goat milk. Both stories have about as much proof as a sandcastle in a storm, but they get repeated anyway, because in the sleepy half-light of a smoky coffeehouse, truth is optional. What isn't optional, however, is the coffee itself. You listen in as the owner debates a customer over portion sizes. Your scoop's too shallow, the man insists. The owner shrugs. Yours is too greedy. They laugh, but not kindly. The problem is simple. No one agrees on the proper ratio of ground coffee to water. And while that might not seem like a big deal when you're serving dozens of customers, many of whom believe themselves to be amateur philosophers, consistency suddenly matters. One coffee too strong, and a patron might stay all night debating the meaning of clouds. Too weak, and he might fall asleep before he can recite his 3rd lamentation about tax hikes. The owner gestures to a dusty shelf, where 5 measuring spoons sit like decorative daggers. He claims they each represent a style of brewing. Viziers cut, soldiers draft, dervishes sip, lovers dose, and his favorite, the merchants lie. You don't ask what that last one means. You just nod, slowly. Outside, the call to prayer rings out again, soft and distant. A few patrons rise, stretch, and shuffle out. Others remain, sipping, watching, mumbling. You finish your cup and wonder whether it contained a full dirham of grounds, or just enough to keep you half awake. There's no real way to know. Not yet. But soon enough, someone will get annoyed enough to do something about it. Not a poet, not a prince, probably not even the Sultan, but a guild or two or three, all equally sleepy, all increasingly bothered by inconsistent scoops and bean inflation, because in the Ottoman Empire, as in life, revolutions don't start with swords, they start with spoons. You're standing now in the warm gloom of a backstreet apothecary, a few blocks removed from the clamor of the coffee house. The door squeaks when you push it open, and a small bell overhead rings half-heartedly, like it's been up all night, contemplating its purpose. Inside, glass bottles line narrow shelves, filled with everything from powdered henna to something suspiciously labeled pickled dragonroot. The apothecary, an elderly man with eyebrows like dormant caterpillars, toward you without looking up from his mortar. He's grinding something with the intensity of a man who once lost a spice duel and vowed revenge. The smell in here is a layered thing, dried herbs, aged leather, and underneath it all, the unmistakable toastiness of ground coffee beans. Yes, coffee has made its way into this world of dried petals and powdered dreams, not just as a drink but as a substance with properties, carefully weighed, measured, and debated like any other substance on these cluttered shelves. You watch as the apothecary pulls out a tiny brass scale, the kind used for measuring out precise doses of medicinal powders. With a spoon no bigger than your thumb, he adds ground coffee bean to one side. Exactly 1 dirham, he says, as if you should know how much that is. Then he adjusts, flicks a weight, and mutters something about balance between spirit and digestion. Historians still argue whether apothecaries like this were the first to formalize coffee measurements, but there's a compelling logic to it. Medicine was one of the only disciplines in the Ottoman world with consistent scales and a trained respect for proportions, and coffee, depending on who you asked, was either a cure for melancholy or a cause of it. You lean closer to the scale. The spoon he used is narrower than any you've seen so far, made from horn and burnished smooth. It looks nothing like the coffeehouse ladles or the palace's ceremonial scoops. Here, the goal isn't performance, it's precision. You use too much, the apothecary grumbles, clearly eavesdropping on your internal thoughts, ruins the stomach and the soul. You nod wisely, pretending you haven't consumed 3 questionable cups today already. He moves on to brewing boiling water in a squat kettle, then adding the grounds with something like reverence. There's no flourish, no lifting of the pot for dramatic foam, just a slow pour into a glazed clay cup, cooled with a breath, and handed to you with an unspoken challenge. Taste and know that the flavor is different, earthy yes, but somehow medicinal. Like if insomnia had a flavor, you pretend to enjoy it and make the universally accepted hum sound of Ottoman approval. Across the room, a younger apprentice is labeling vials. He's got smudges of ink on his cheeks and is carefully writing coffee, warming, drying, good for melancholy and wind. You raise an eyebrow. Wind. He shrugs. Some say it clears the head, others say it clears everything. Noted. The apothecary shows you a chart pinned to the wall on old parchment, comparing different volumes, a dirham, a misk, aka, and something called a zarful, which appears to be defined as whatever fits when you're not paying attention. Charming. It becomes clear that while merchants and courtiers may squabble over foam and flavor, it's the apothecaries who are quietly building the backbone of standard measurement, and they're doing it for health reasons. Because once people start drinking coffee daily and many defects become part of medical discussion, too much causes hot blood, too little leaves one with spirit fatigue. One apothecary in Bursa reportedly developed an elaborate dosing guide based on body size, moon phase, and whether or not the drinker had quarreled with their mother recently. You imagine Ottoman FDA meetings. You shudder. Still, some fringe practitioners start recommending coffee as a treatment for headaches, sluggish digestion, and even heartbreak. You hear murmurs of a remedy involving coffee and crushed basil for overactive imagination, which feels like a polite way of diagnosing poets. You sip again. There's something soothing about this quiet corner of the city where coffee is taken seriously, not as status or spectacle, but as daily ritual and remedy. No one here is trying to impress the Sultan. They just want your liver to function and your humor to remain balanced. In a society obsessed with mizaj, the balance of hot, cold, moist, and dry coffee is a new variable, one that needs to be understood and weighed. Exactly. The apothecary pats his scale gently and says, "This never lies." You smile. He does not. Outside, the wind rustles wooden chimes. You step back into the street, feeling the weight of a deer in your bones, the slow bloom of coffee in your chest, and a growing sense that all of this, the beans, the spoons, the balance, has only just begun. You step out of the apothecary's shop and into the late afternoon light, blinking like you've been underground for days. The street has a slow-motion rhythm, now fewer shouting merchants, more shuffling slippers. Even the pigeons on the mosque's dome seem quieter, half dozing in the sun. You wander toward the edge of a covered market, where a commotion is softly brewing, not a riot, just a politely escalating debate among the city's coffee guilds. You duck into the shade, find a perch on an overturned crate, and eavesdrop like any responsible Ottoman citizen mildly addicted to drama. Today's argument: how heavy is a sip? It's a valid question, surprisingly complex when you really get into it. How much ground coffee should go into a cup? How deep should the spoon be? Should a spoonful be heaping, flat, or gently rounded like the Bosphorus at dawn? The answers are many, and conflicting, and often delivered while waving handkerchiefs in the air. The gathered guildsmen wear patterned vests, slightly sweat-stained turbans, and expressions ranging from amused to personally offended. One man tall, stern, with the wiry grace of someone who sharpens his own cutlery, slaps a copper spoon on a low table. This, he declares, is the spoon of truth. Someone snorts. Another man, round-bellied with fingers stained from roasting beans, counters, that's the spoon of nonsense. It measures only for your thimble-sized cups in Galata. We brew for conversation. That's the crux of it. Context. Palace. Brews were tiny, potent, and symbolic. But in the public cafes and home kitchens, coffee was communal, designed to be sipped slowly while unraveling tales about your mother-in-law, or quietly speculating whether the Janissaries were getting uppity again. Historians still debate whether these coffee guild meetings were semi-official or simply informal, trade conventions with snacks. But evidence points to some actual authority. By the mid-17th century, Istanbul boasted guilds for roasters, grinders, brewers, and cup makers, each with its own regulations and standards, and opinions. Oh, the opinions you watch now as a guild scribe unrolls a parchment, smoothed from too much use. It displays, in surprisingly elegant calligraphy, a proposed universal coffee scoop size, equal to 2/3 of a dirhem, with an allowance for foam bloom virulence. The group murmurs like a flock of mildly perturbed pigeons. You learn a new phrase today: skeevy hacky, the right of liquid. It refers to the belief that each paying customer deserves a consistent volume of beverage, and it becomes the rallying cry of the pro-standardization guilds, who are tired of rogue vendors using spoons no larger than a chickpea husk. But not everyone agrees. The resistance faction, mostly independent brewers and cafe owners, believe standardization will kill creativity. One man argues that his three-finger scoop yields a richer brew, and that the gods of coffee would smite any who dared flatten it. You try not to laugh. He's very serious. Eventually, a compromise is proposed, a three-tier system: small, medium, and large scoops, each defined in dirhem and marked with a distinct etching, a tulip, a crescent, or a tiny ladle. A whispered suggestion about tax-based labeling nearly sparks a fistfight, but it passes, barely. The meeting adjourns as the sun begins its descent, casting honey-colored light on the old stones. A few guild members linger, sipping from ceramic cups and continuing their debate in softer tones. One man offers you a taste of his 5-spice roast, claiming it tastes different depending on your thoughts. You're skeptical. He's right. As you rise, stretching your legs, you realize something quietly revolutionary has happened here. These weren't palace bureaucrats. These were vendors, artisans, everyday people, and they'd just voted on weights and measures. Not for gold or wheat, but for coffee. Coffee had become so woven into the fabric of daily life that it now demanded precision, repeatability, equity, and spoons. So many spoons. You pass a vendor. On the way out, his table lined with handcrafted scoops, bone-handled, silver-chased, carved from olive wood or ebony. One has a fish motif. Another resembles a bird's beak. They're art, but they're also tools. You purchase one, just to hold. It fits snugly in your palm, warm from the sun. Surprisingly heavy. You dip it into your memory and wonder, is this the weight of a perfect sip? Maybe, maybe not. But it's the start of something. Morning spills slowly into the market district as you wind your way through arched alleys, past sleepy-eyed cats and merchants yawning behind towers of cinnamon bark. Today, you're heading to the Masa Car Scoother Egyptian Bazaar. The air hums with the scent of crushed cloves and the quiet shuffle of bureaucracy, because something big is happening. Coffee is officially becoming a regulated good, yes. After decades of impromptu scooping, exaggerated servings, and guild squabbles so slow-paced they could lull a tax collector to sleep, the empire has decided to put pen to parchment and tell everyone, once and for all, exactly how much ground coffee constitutes a legal serving, and you, lucky you, arrive just in time to watch it unfold. The crowd is larger than expected. Vendors, roasters, even a few finely dressed clerks holding silk umbrellas. Despite the complete absence of sun, an official steps onto a low wooden platform, flanked by two guards who look like they've never successfully brewed anything stronger than warm milk. He unfurls a scroll so long it brushes the tops of his boots. By decree of the he begins, and the recommendations of the Guild Council, the serving weight of coffee is hereby standardized. You blink slowly. Is this really happening? Yes, dear listener. It is. The Ottoman Empire, known for poetry, tulips, and tightly coiled bureaucracy, has turned its gaze toward the bean dot. From now on, all roasted coffee beans sold in the capital must be weighed using Derham-calibrated scales. No approximations, no half scoops. If the customer looks small, shops must display their certified spoons openly. Any attempt to heap deceptively will be fined. Yes, that's the actual phrase. You almost applaud. Historians still debate the precise year this happened, some citing 1663, others leaning toward the 1670s, depending on which shipping records or scribbled guild diaries you trust. But all agree, coffee had reached a tipping point. It wasn't just culture anymore, it was commerce, and commerce demands consistency. You drift through the bazaar as inspectors begin their rounds. You see them at work, lifting scoops, weighing beans, comparing foam height to volume charts so detailed they probably deserve their own sultan. One inspector mutters, "This brews one chickpea over." His colleague gasps. Not all vendors are thrilled, of course. One elderly grinder loudly proclaims that his family's scooping method predates the conquest of Constantinople, and that standardization is the first step toward cultural extinction. Another just shrugs and slaps an official seal on his brass scoop, muttering, "Now the beans cost more." Of course they do. You pause at a stall where a middle-aged woman with ink-stained fingers is measuring out beans onto a tarazi scale. Her scoop is elegant, slim, scalloped, engraved with verses from Rumi. She sees you eyeing it and offers a gentle, amused smile. "It's just a spoon," she says, "but now it matters." She lets you try a scoop. It's heavier than it looks. A gentle thunk of beans hits the copper tray, and something oddly satisfying settles in your chest. It's official, measured, validated. There's a strange peace in it, like organizing a cluttered drawer or watching someone comb a beach with perfect lines. Elsewhere, city scribes are already revising ledgers. Coffee now has a fixed tax rate, based on its standard weight, and fines are applied per acre, the bulk measure for roasted goods. You overhear a customer trying to haggle over a half-dirham discount, only to be politely laughed at by a merchant who now carries paperwork. For better or worse, the empire has spoken. You stop by the edge of the bazaar where a coppersmith is, reshaping ladles to meet the new dimensions. He hammers slowly, rhythmically, turning broad-bellied scoops into precise instruments. "The age of flamboyant heaps is over," he says, grinning. "We now enter the era of modest mounds." You chuckle, but deep down you realize what's really happening here. This isn't just about cups and scoops. It's about trust. Between seller and buyer, between cafe owner and sleepy patron, between apothecary and anxious patient. A sip isn't just a sip anymore, it's a promise. And now, that promise has weight. Literally. As the sun dips behind the mosque domes and the call to prayer echoes softly across the city, you sip a cup poured from the first officially regulated batch. It tastes the same but somehow better, like you're part of something. A bean-to-cup ritual etched into the empire's bones. Bonds measured, balanced, bot-made, just right. Evening settles over Istanbul like a velvet shawl. The city glows in candlelight and ember flare, its breath slowing, its voice growing softer. You turn into a quieter quarter now past the warehouses, past the spice cellars winding down, and find yourself at the open door of something new, something still whispering its way into the city's bloodstream. A crowthane, literally, a reading house. But don't let the name fool you. You step inside, and the first thing that greets you is the scent coffee, of course. Simmering gently over coals butt, mingled with the dry musk of old parchment and the sweetness of dust-covered ink. A man in robes is reading aloud in the corner, his voice buttery, unhurried, like he knows exactly how many syllables you can handle before falling asleep upright. You've walked into one of the Ottoman Empire's most beloved, if underestimated, institutions, the Reading Cafe, and here, the coffee isn't just strong, it's scholarly. These spaces began cropping up in the 18th century, born from the marriage of coffeehouse and library, fed by the literacy boom, and warmed by the endless need for communal caffeine. Find a cushion near the back and settle in with a steaming cup, surrounded by men in soft turbans and long coats, some with scrolls unrolled across their laps, others just gently dozing, their fingers still pinching a page. A clerk walks by with a tray of coffee and newspapers, yes, printed Ottoman Turkish. Even if the print smudges and the ink smells like overcooked beetroot, you take one, mostly to look busy. What you're really here for is the atmosphere. It's quiet, not silent, just layered. Spoons clink, pages turn. Someone sighs softly, maybe at a poorly written sonnet, and the coffee, here, the measurement, is nearly sacred. You hear the barista at the back muttering the ratio as he brews half dirham for clarity, a full for insight, never more, or you'll start rewriting law. He's only half joking. Historians still argue whether the crowthane was a top-down innovation, introduced to encourage more orderly leisure, or a grassroots evolution by knowledge-hungry artisans who wanted somewhere to read that smelled better than the paper mills. Either way, it's stuck here. Knowledge is paired with warmth, with foam, with precise scoops of roasted Yemeni beans ground until they whisper. And here's the fun part. In most crowthan coffee portions are stricter than in taverns or open-air cafes. You notice a metal template on the prep tabula, spoon-shaped mold, used to level the grounds before they hit the says. Standardization isn't a nuisance here. It's a sign of quality, and consistency, for readers and dreamers alike, is comfort. One patron bespectacled, practically part of the upholstery, leans over and whispers to you. They say the coffee here helps memorization. 3 sips, 4 names, 5 for dates, a full cup for understanding battle formations. You nod solemnly. Naturally. Another man at the window is sketching a camel wearing reading glasses. No one questions it. You ask the barista how they handle newcomers, tourists, wanderers, insomniac poets. Do they measure differently? He shrugs. The spoon doesn't lie, he says. It levels us all. You sip outside. Rain begins to tick gently on the tiled awnings. Inside, the crowthane glows with quiet thought and caffeinated calm. It is neither palace nor bazaar, not quite a school, not quite a saloon. It is something gentler, a dream incubator, as your cup nears empty. The reading voice in the corner continues, low and slow, reciting a tale from a dusty Ottoman romance in which a coffee spoon is mistaken for a sacred relic, and the heroine has to duel a scribe over its true ownership. You don't care whether the story is true, you just want another cup. The rain has slowed to a whisper now, misting the cobblestones and softening the edges of Istanbul's skyline. Lanterns glow like sleepy fireflies along narrow lanes as you make your way to a quieter district, where gossip is traded not in cafes or books but in courtrooms. Yes, you're here to witness a case filed under one of the Ottoman Empire's most peculiar legal categories. Scoop, fraud. Technically, the charge reads, intentional underscooping of coffee grounds in violation of trade weight statutes. The defendant, a merchant named Haki, owner of a modest stand near the Atika Valid Mosque. The offense, serving visibly smaller scoops to foreign travelers who wouldn't know better anyway. A cardinal sin in a society increasingly obsessed with fairness in foam. The courthouse is no grand palace, just a long, low room with painted tiles and a magistrate who looks like he's been inhaling burnt cloves for 3 decades. You sit quietly in the back, your robe still damp at the hem, as the scribe begins reading out the formal complaint. Witnesses are called. One claims his coffee tasted like hot rainwater. Another accuses the merchant of dishonoring the bean. Haki, in his defense, argues that it was windy that day and some of the grounds may have escaped. The room titters politely. Historians still argue. whether such cases were taken seriously or merely performed for the sake of public trust, but the records exist, and they're not few. Coffee-related disputes, especially those involving scoop size, appear with increasing frequency in 17th and 18th century court archives. And always. The language is poetic. You glance at a clerk's open register and see one entry described as a beverage too thin to mourn with. Another, grounds scattered like ash before judgment. The Ottomans didn't just file complaints, they wrote them like laments. But don't let the poetry fool you. These cases mattered. Coffee had become an expectation, a right, an everyday pleasure that required regulation. Much like weighing bread or cutting cloth, it was a commercial promise. If you sold a cup, it better be what the customer believed they were paying for. And now, in the soft drone of the courtroom, the judge lifts a small leather pouch. From it, he removes a spoon. Yes, this court travels with its own standard scoop, held in a velvet-lined box like a jewel. A clerk places it beside the merchant's alleged ladle. The judge frowns. Hack's scoop is noticeably shallower, worn from use. Perhaps pour may be carved that way from the start. The room holds its breath. Then comes the moment of quiet theatre. The tear and test. The court's assistant fetches roasted beans from the registries, Storius. There's a sealed jar for just this purpose, and begins the delicate work of scooping, weighing, leveling. 1 dirham, 1 flat spoon. No heap, no cheat. You could hear a callum drop. The verdict, when it comes, is soft but firm. Hacky is fined to silver coins, to be paid to the local guild, and must replace his scoop with one certified by the Chamber of Commerce. His expression is equal parts relief and shame. Coffee dishonor cuts deeper than coin. After the proceedings, you follow the magistrate into a side room where he removes his turban and rubs his temples. "You wouldn't believe how many scoop cases I get," he mutters. "Last week someone tried to file a grievance over inconsistent foam behavior." He pours you a small cup from a hidden samovar, perfectly balanced. As you sip, he tells you a story, a widow who ran a stall outside the Yeni Kami, known for giving extra scoops to the poor and one-eyed veterans. When inspectors fined her for excessive generosity, the local imam paid the fee himself, declaring that justice without warmth tastes like sand. It's unclear whether the story is true, but it feels true. You finish your cup as the candles begin to dim. The city hums outside, and you realize, for the 100th time tonight, that in the Ottoman world, coffee isn't just a drink, it's a mirror, a measure, a question of fairness, trust, and exactly how much fits on a spoon. You find yourself now following a narrow stone path that curves away from the bustle of Istanbul's commercial quarters. The cobblestones grow uneven, and the sounds of hawkers fade, replaced by the hush of wind through plane trees and the distant lilt of a ney flute. You're headed to a Tekka Sufi dervish lodge where the atmosphere is softer, almost drowsy, and the coffee is sacred in ways the palace never dreamed of. As you enter the shaded courtyard, barefooted novices greet you with gentle nods. Everything here seems wrapped in layers of quiet footsteps, speech, even the swish of robes. And yes, of course, coffee is being brewed. But here, it's not fuel for conversation or a measuring contest, it's a ritual. You sit cross-legged near the lodge's open-air kitchen, where an elder dervish with a beard like driftwood and a gaze that could read minds is slowly stirring a pot. The sez isn't ornate. The spoon he uses isn't hammered silver. It's carved from olive wood, dark with age and slightly warped. You suspect it predates most of the empire. He scoops a single spoonful into the boiling water and murmurs something, probably a prayer, though it might also be a commentary on how tourists oversweeten their coffee. You watch the grounds swirl, rise, and settle. Every scoop, he says without turning, is a question, not an answer. Naturally, here in the Sufi tradition, coffee carries mystic significance. It's not just warmth or flavor, it's clarity, a way to still the self. For some sects, it opens the heart to divine whispers. For others, it simply helps keep one awake during long zikr ceremonies, where chants and breathing exercises spiral into trances deeper than sleep. Historians still argue whether coffee was accepted in Sufi orders from the beginning, or only later, as part of broader Yemeni influence. Some dervish communities embraced it with such enthusiasm that brewing techniques became almost as sacred as recitations. Others resisted, insisting only water should pass their lips in the presence of prayer. But here, in this tech, The coffee is part of the rhythm. It's offered at dawn, again at dusk, and sometimes in the middle of the night when dreams feel more real than daylight. And unlike the palaces and marketplaces, no two scoops here are the same, or ever will be. You sip your cup of tea floral, somehow weightless. The foam is imperfect, the taste borders on bittersweet, and yet there's something about it that steadies your pulse. You're not sure if it's the brewing or the silence, but something inside you settles. Later, during a quiet moment under a fig tree, two younger dervishes begin discussing the nature of measurement. One argues for standardization, that in order to properly prepare for meditation, a balanced dosage is needed. Too much, and you chase visions. Too little, and your breath falls flat. The other insists that the amount must change with the person, the moment, even the moon's phase. We are not jars, he says. We cannot be filled the same way every day. You sip and nod. Both seem equally correct. A third, dervish, older, passing by, mutters, "Just stir until it smells like remembering." You don't write that down, but you should have. The night deepens. Lamps are lit. Someone brings a tray of dried figs, and the air begins to fill with the rhythmic hum of a gathering zikr. You sit just outside, within earshot, the vibration of breath and syllable threading through your spine, and all the while, someone keeps the pot warm. In the Sufi kitchen there's a saying, "The world is stirred with a spoon no man sees." You believe it now, because even in a world of bureaucratic scales and guild-approved ladles, there is still a corner of the empire where coffee resists being measured, where meaning matters more than metrics, and where the perfect cup cannot be repeated, only received. Morning returns, pale and a little creaky, like a wooden cart rolling over uneven stones. You're back on the road again, but not in the city. No, this time you're traveling with a merchant caravan, winding its sleepy way through the Anatolian countryside. Dust clings to your sleeves, and the air smells like sun-warmed leather and recently crushed fennel. You're here to witness what happens when coffee meets trade. And trade being the eternally cranky beast, it starts demanding consistency. The caravan's lead trader is a wiry man named Osman, with a voice like gravel soaked in syrup, and a pack mule named Devlet, who seems smarter than most humans. Osman deals in more than coffee. He peddles cloves, nutmeg, dried apricots, and strings of beads made from something politely labeled meditative wood. You share a tent with him on the second night, where he unfolds a cloth-wrapped ledger and begins mumbling prices and weights. Coffee, he mutters, changes value every 15 steps. Because here's the rub. Though the empire had begun regulating coffee weights in cities like Istanbul, rural and border markets still did things their own way. You might trade 1 acre of beans in Bursa for silver, but in Diyarbakir, it's cloves. In Aleppo, nutmeg. In Tibri, silk thread, and a promise to deliver extra foam next spring. It's not just currency that shifts its measurement. Osman shows you 3 different scoops he carries, one for each provincial checkpoint. This one's for local markets, he says, holding up a carved walnut spoon. This one's for tax inspections. He taps a heavier brass one, already dulled with use. And this one, he pauses, pulling out a tiny, battered scoop, the size of your thumb, is for dealing with the Dutch. Naturally, historians still argue how much influence foreign merchants had on Ottoman coffee measurements. Some believe the pressure to conform to European weights and scales led to stricter imperial regulation. Others argue the reverse, that the empire doubled down on its own standards to resist outside control. Either way, coffee was increasingly tangled in trade diplomacy. During one roadside stop, you help Osman haggle with a Persian trader over a shipment of bitter orange blossoms. The trader insists Osman's coffee is too coarsely ground. Osman retorts that Persian scales are always a fig short of honest. They eventually compromise by splitting the difference in spoon size and tossing in a complimentary tin of saffron. Trade, as ever, is just polite arguing with paperwork. You continue westward, passing through sleepy hamlets where coffee is still roasted over sheepdung fires and served in cracked ceramic cups. The spoons are whatever is handy, sometimes carved, sometimes pinched from the end of a bamboo shoot. No one seems bothered. Here, a cup is a mood, not a measurement. But once you reach the larger hub towns, Konya, Kayseri, Ankara, you see the difference. Inspectors, registry books, certified scoops, even a merchant booth offering sealed spoons of guaranteed weight. They come in little velvet bags, sold like jewelry. You buy one. It's heavier than expected, and smells faintly of ink and law. At one caravanserai, overhear a spice trader muttering about coffee tax weights, ruining his profit margins. Now they count the beans, he says, as if it's some new form of imperial cruelty. You sip a small copper cup in the shade of the courtyard and realize, coffee, once a symbol of connection and contemplation, is now currency. It moves in sacks and scoops. It is taxed, tracked, stored, and standardized. And like anything valuable, it causes friction. At one border post near the Armenian plateau, a sleepy official demands to inspect Osman's coffee load. He pulls out a measuring spoon from the capital, weighs a sample, then frowns. This scoop looks light. Osman smiles. It's the wind. They laugh, then settle it with a bribe so small it might have been just a few cherries and a handful of clove. You ride on. Later, Osman turns to you and says, "You know what's funny? We measure everything. We label, we argue, we seal. But still, someone always says, this cup tastes different than last time." He chuckles and spits a date pit into the grass. Maybe it's the water, or maybe it's us. You nod, because somewhere between the city decree and the camel-laden road, you've come to understand, standardization doesn't erase subjectivity. It just gives it better packaging. As night falls, you sit by the fire, listening to the wheeze of boiling kettles and the soft crunch of beans being ground between stone plates. A caravan boy stirs a pot, counting heartbeats instead of weight. The brew he serves you is rough, gritty, and unexpectedly comforting. Off to your left, Osman mutters in his sleep, 2 scoops in Aleppo, 1.25 in Ankara, just foam. In Venice, the stars blink overhead. And the caravan rolls on. You arrive back in the city just before dawn, bones rattled from the caravan trail, and eyebrows permanently dusted in cumin. The sun peeks shyly over domes and minarets as you slip into the quiet warmth of the hammam, the Ottoman bathhouse. For a scrub, but for something more secretive. Coffee gossip in the women's quarters. Yes, tonight you're crossing the threshold into the world of steamy tiles, clinking bracelets, and murmured recipes passed from mother to daughter, friend to friend. The hammam is not just a place for cleansing, it's where news is exchanged, alliances are formed, and, naturally, the best coffee in the city is quietly brewed behind a curtain of rose-scented mist. You pad softly over the slick marble floor, the air thick with jasmine oil and the kind of warmth that makes your muscles sigh. A group of women is already gathered near a low basin, sipping from tiny porcelain cups, their heads wrapped in damp cloths, earrings glinting like polished spoons. One gestures for you to join them. You do. The coffee here is nothing short of revelatory, flavored with crushed cardamom, a pinch of mastic, and a whisper of something floral you can't place. The foam is perfect. The sweetness, strategic. This, one woman says proudly, is a bridal blend. You raise an eyebrow. She laughs. If your coffee doesn't settle the stomach and stir the heart, you'll never win a mother-in-law. That's the rule. Here, coffee as matchmaking alchemy. Recipes are passed down not just for taste, but for effect. Blends that calm nerves, ones that subtly impress, others designed to spark conversation, or, in extreme cases, hide the taste of nervous perspiration. Historians still debate how widespread these rituals were, but Ottoman folk tales and a few suspiciously poetic bitter marriage contracts point to a tradition of coffee presentation during courtship. Prospective brides were judged not only on embroidery and manner, but also on how well they could brew. A burnt pot, bad omen. Too strong, overbearing, too weak, unready. You sip your cup again. It is confident. Across the room, 2 women are comparing scoops. One pulls out a delicate measuring spoon carved from ivory, an heirloom, she says, passed down from her great-grandmother who served in the palace kitchens. The other holds up a scoop made of mother. It catches the steam light like moonstone. There is a long, respectful silence. Then someone jokes, "Well, mine is just a regular spoon from the bazaar." Everyone laughs, and she receives a second cup as penance. This is a different world from the palace or the crathane. Here, measurement is personal, not decreed, not taxed. A spoon isn't just about volume, it's about trust. A hostess knows how much you like. A mother can brew your comfort without asking. It's an emotional calibration passed through generations, rarely written down. One elderly matron shares her rule. 1 scoop for good news, 2. If your sister's being annoying, fair. And while men debate spoon shapes in court and merchants haggle over bean weight, women quietly perfect the art of brewbifill, where instinct trumps calibration and consistency comes from memory, not metal molds. Yet, even here, the weight of officialdom has crept in. One younger woman pulls out a copy of a recipe pamphlet printed in Üsküdar, boasting imperial standard measurements. "My husband says I should follow it," she sighs. The others roll their eyes in unison, a small storm of disagreement gently brewing in the mist. "Tell him to stir his own pot," someone says. You breathe deeply, lulled by the scent of crushed mint and roasted grounds. Somewhere in this steam-filled mosaic, the lines between regulation and ritual blur. You begin to understand that even as the empire tightens its grip on trade and measurement, the heart of coffee lives here, in the giggle between sips, in the hand that remembers your favorite spoon, in the love stories told between tile echoes. As the hammam begins to empty and towels are gathered like fallen petals, someone presses a scoop into your palm. It's simple wooden, worn smooth, no ornamentation at all. "For your own kitchen," she says. "It measures nothing exactly, and everything just right." You nod. No inscription needed, just warmth. You walk back through Istanbul's hushed streets as dusk falls over the rooftops like a velvet blanket. The call to prayer lingers in the air, fading into the background hum of the city preparing for night. But you're not ready for sleep yet. No, there's one more place to visit, a little candlelit room behind a Sufi bookshop, where a few mystics, poets, and wandering thinkers sip measured cups of coffee and debate the universe. Tonight, they're working on something simple, the soul of the bean. You arrive to find them already gathered, 7 men in soft robes, seated cross-legged on low cushions. Scrolls and tea-stained papers are spread out around them like spilled secrets. In the center, a low table with 3 sezivs, 5 spoons of varying size, and a tin of fresh roasted beans that smells like burnt honey, and stargazing. No one greets you formally. They just scoot over and pour you a cup. It is excellent. Of course. Tonight's topic: how many sips it takes to see God. The answer, apparently, ranges from 1 if your heart is ready to 17 if you over-roast the beans. The youngest of the group is reciting poetry. It's something about foam mirroring the moon, and a cup too full to swallow grief. A white-haired dervish nods approvingly, then sprinkles a dash of cinnamon into his brew without explanation. You sip, slowly, and realize this isn't an ordinary gathering. These men are not just drinking coffee, they are using it as a tool, as a medium, to think, to write, to reach somewhere softer than language. The conversation drifts to measurement. One scholar argues that the ideal amount of grounds is exactly 1 1/5 darims, based on astrological readings and body weight. Another counters that taste memory is more reliable than weight. "I trust my tongue, not a scale," he says, licking his lips as if to prove a point. A third stands, walks to a shelf, and retrieves a faded chart labeled Kahve Ration v. Russell Dengler, Coffee Ratios and Spiritual Equilibriums. It's a combination of dosage recommendations and celestial mappings. You're not sure whether to study it or frame it. Historians still argue whether Sufi scholars contributed to formal coffee measurement or resisted it entirely. Some left behind meticulously annotated recipes. Others destroyed such records as distractions from the true work of the soul. In this room, both approaches are alive and well. As the night deepens, someone places an hourglass on the table. The group agrees. 1 scoop per half glass. Stir clockwise, thrice. Serve when the foam whispers. You do exactly that, and the resulting brew tastes like snowfall inside a library. A heated discussion breaks out over a recent pamphlet from Bursa, claiming that coffee should never be boiled more than once. "Nonsense," one man declares. "Every soul deserves a second chance. So does a pot." The others laugh softly, kindly. No one's in a hurry to win. This is the Sufi way, to engage with the world as metaphor, to weigh not just beans but intentions, to believe a spoon can stir more than liquid. And so the cups keep coming. Between each, the conversation spirals gently into dreams. One man describes a vision he had after drinking too much coffee on a fast day, a garden filled with brewing pots, each one tended by a different prophet. Another shares a folktale about a dervish whose coffee spoon could translate emotions into poetry, but only if you stirred with your eyes closed. You try it. Nothing happens. Yet, you notice the spoons used here are worn smooth, their inscriptions nearly gone. One has a groove in the handle, from years of thumb pressure. Another bears a faded inlay of a tulip now, just a ghost in the wood. None match the imperial standards, and no one seems to care, because here, the measure is mood. Before you leave, one of the elders pulls out a tiny folded paper and hands it to you. Inside is a single line of calligraphy. A true scoop is the one your heart remembers. You tuck it into your sleeve. Then step out into the crisp night, where the stars are watching, and the city dreams in caffeine and candlelight. You're back in Istanbul's administrative district now, where the buildings wear their seriousness, like heavy coats. The street is quieter here, not in a cozy, lullaby way, but in the bureaucratic hush of places where paperwork is sacred, and even coffee is processed with official solemnity. You have an appointment, not with a vizier or a scholar, but with a man from the Bureau of Commerce Standards. His name is Salel, and he's about to show you something special. The long-awaited, officially sanctioned Ottoman standard coffee spoon. Yes, after generations of guessing, dozens of lawsuits over sloshed foam, and more guild arguments than any reasonable empire should survive, the empire has landed on a single, agreed-upon scoop. You're here for its grand unveiling, or, more accurately, its quiet placement inside a display case next to 2 wax seals and an exhausted scribe with carpal tunnel. You follow Salel down a winding hallway lined with records. He moves slowly, as if every step carries paperwork. Eventually, he opens a door into a room no bigger than a storage closet. Inside, a velvet-lined pedestal, a sealed glass case, and within it a spoon. Not gold, not jewel-encrusted, just functional. Elegant in its simplicity. Polished brass, shaped like a slightly elongated almond, with a flat handle that widens into a tulip motif near the tip. Engraved in minuscule script, "Bir dirhem kov, ikin." For 1 dirhem of coffee. You stare. You don't expect emotion, but you feel it anyway. This is the result of centuries of improvisation, rebellion, hospitality, mysticism, and guesswork, condensed, finalized, ratified by the empire, and accepted reluctantly or otherwise by the palaces, the hammams, the croathane, and the caravans. Celal sighs, rubbing his temples. It took 12 years to finalize the curvature. 12, you ask? He nods. We had a foam collapse incident. Nearly lost the whole proposal. Of course, historians still argue whether this standard spoon actually saw widespread adoption. Some say only major cities enforced it. Others claim most vendors ignored it unless an inspector loomed. But either way, its existence mattered. For once, everyone at least on paper had the same base measure. You get to hold the spoon. Gently Salel warns you not to breathe too hard on it. It's surprisingly light. And yet, you feel its weight. He hands you a certified replica in a velvet pouch, for demonstration only, he warns. You nod solemnly. You've seen what happens when people stir recklessly. Later that day, you attend a coffee demonstration, hosted by the Guild of Brewers. A young apprentice steps up, places 1 dirhem of freshly ground Yemeni beans into the sesvis in the standard spoon, adds water from a pre-measured jug, stirs clockwise with ceremonial slowness, and pours into a cup lined with gold filigree. The crowd nods, a few claps, so and whispers, "Foam integrity, excellent." You sip. It's good, solid, predictable, a far cry from the chaos of border brew, or the poetry of hammam mixtures, but that's the point. You could replicate this, anyone could. And yet, in the back of the room, an old merchant mutters, "Still, tastes better when my daughter makes it by feel." You don't disagree. Standardization doesn't erase soul, it just frames it. It lets the palace match the street stall, the border checkpoint match the crothane. It gives language to preference, form to ritual, shape to memory. You return the spoon to its case, feeling like you've said goodbye to an old companion. But as Salel locks the door, he hands you a ledger. Inside are adjusted measurement tables, for thicker grinds, high-altitude boils, and even emotionally generous servings. Apparently, even the empire knew 1 scoop couldn't please every cup. As the sun dips behind the domes of the old city, casting long shadows over spice carts and worn marble steps, you tuck the certified replica into your sleeve and walk slowly, quietly. You now hold in your hand the official measure of a sipper tool that took 1,000 unmeasured moments to create. And it is, somehow, both too much and not quite enough. It's early morning again, and the city wakes with a stretch and a sigh. The domes are dewy, the pigeons are politely arguing on rooftops, and a breeze from the Bosphorus carries the smell of coal fires and rising dough. You're standing outside. A neighborhood coffee stall, nothing fancy, just a plank nailed across a doorway, 2 stools, and a kettle that's seen better decades. The vendor is already at work, boiling water in his dented says, grinding beans with a rhythm that matches the flick of his wrist, his scoop, the standard spoon, worn but recognizable. Its tulip motif still glints in the morning light, and as you stand there, watching this simple ritual unfold, you begin to notice something strange. Everyone's timing their day by it. The grocer across the street waits for his first cup before lifting his shutters. A pair of scholars sip in sync, flipping their notebooks open on the second sip. Even the local imam, really in a rush, has his call to prayer aligned to after the coffee stirs. This is it, coffee as metronome. Not just comfort, not just custom, clockwork. It makes sense, in a way. For all its mystery and sensuality, coffee is remarkably predictable. It takes time to boil, time to pour, time to cool, time to sip. And now, with a standardized spoon, the brew takes roughly the same amount of time everywhere, in the palace, in the port, in the hammam, in the caravan camp, and here, at this modest neighborhood stand. Historians still argue when this shift occurred, when coffee stopped being solely a pleasure and became a schedule. Some say the postal guilds were the first to notice. Deliveries ran smoother when coffee breaks were consistent. Others blame clockmakers, who began aligning mechanisms to the duration of a brew. You sip your cup. It's good, familiar, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's just right in volume, in flavor, in foam. It is the product of all the chaos, all the guild meetings, all the spoon calibrations and disputed dirhams and dervish debates, and now, somehow, your heartbeat syncs with it. You glance down the street and see a man adjusting a sundial. Another waves from a window, holding a tiny porcelain cup. A boy runs past you with 2 wooden scoops tied to his belt like swords. The whole neighborhood is running on coffee time, and beneath the surface of this quiet, sleepy coordination is the tool that made it all possible. A spoon, not glamorous, not revolutionary, just steady, consistent, a shape agreed upon by 1,000 tired hands. You finish your cup and return it to the stall. The vendor nods. You walk on, carried not by urgency, but by rhythm. The coffee's rhythm, the empire's pulse, and in your coat pocket the certified spoon nudges your side like a reminder. Every revolution starts with something small. Word count, 1040 wind down, final 300 words. And now, here we are, quiet again. The story of spoons and steam winding down like the last trace of foam in the bottom of a gently swirled cup. You imagine the streets of old Istanbul now. Just past midnight, lanterns flicker low. Water trickles softly from a public fountain. A cat curls itself around the base of a stall, dreaming perhaps of cardamom and roasted crumbs. Somewhere, deep in a quiet courtyard, someone still stirs a pot out of habit, maybe, or comfort, or simply to mark time. The spoon rests, its purpose fulfilled for the day. No drama, no declarations, just a measure of calm, of control, of connection. Comforting, isn't it? That something as small as a scoop of ground beans could help organize an empire, could guide conversations, define friendships, settle disputes, and synchronize the rise and fall of daily life. The people may be gone, the guilds dissolved, the ledgers closed, but the rhythm remains. You can still feel it in the way your tea cools, or the sound of your kettle just before it boils, in the quiet minute between stirring and pouring, the breath you take before a sip. So settle deeper now. Let the last of the story soften in your mind, like the thick layer of grounds settling at the bottom of an old Fincan cup. No need to stir anymore. Just let it be still. Let it be warm. Don't let yourself drift.